This timeline tracks a core assumption that drove classical political philosophy for 2,500 years. From Plato through the Enlightenment, the consensus was that there exists an optimal, permanent political order, a perfect state of affairs that, once built, simply needs to be maintained. This mindset bled directly into the post-Cold War era. We inherited an implicit Hegelian optimism, the belief that history was marching in a straight line, converging toward increasingly rational, permanent institutions. But the international system does not actually converge toward a final static equilibrium. The assumption of a permanent order is a structural flaw. The reality is that uncertainty in geopolitics cannot be eliminated. It can only be managed. When you model your foreign policy on reaching a fixed endpoint, you build rigid systems that break under stress. Traditional strategies consistently fail to secure long-term stability in modern environments because they try to solve for permanence in a reality governed by continuous change. The Carney-Stubb view starts with an entirely different premise. Geopolitical order is strictly temporary. In this framework, adaptation is the permanent state of affairs. This borrows heavily from complexity science. Rather than trying to force a system into a static balance, it treats international relations as a state of dynamic equilibrium. Statecraft moves from asking, how do we build the perfect order, to how do we maintain stability inside unavoidable change? Modern statecraft requires abandoning the philosophy of static permanence. Enduring success relies on sustaining the capacity for continuous adaptation, a philosophy of resilient continuity. This flowchart models how the 20th century viewed the world, essentially like a machine. It relied on stable parts, permanent alliances, and a clear, rigid hierarchy. Treating geopolitical alliances and institutions as fixed objects creates a severe vulnerability. When the environment shifts rapidly, a rigid structure cannot flex, it snaps. To resolve this, the framework draws on an alternative to static realism, known as process philosophy. Proposed by thinkers like Alfred North Whitehead, this perspective argues that reality consists of ongoing events rather than static things. Applied to the international stage, politics is treated as a state of continual becoming, abandoning the idea of a global chessboard populated by fixed pieces. This dynamic map illustrates the structural transition required, the move toward network philosophy. The architecture operates differently here. Temporary clusters emerge and dissolve based on adaptive flows rather than formal treaties. Within this fluid system, the actual relationships and ongoing interactions matter far more than any permanent institutional framework. The old machine model prioritized predictability above all else. The network model sacrifices predictability to prioritize adaptation. When you face a decentralized, highly adaptive environment, attempting to impose an inflexible hierarchy is a catastrophic structural failure. Survival requires agility. When we zoom in to a single node on this network map, we can analyze the internal anatomy of a single state. In a complex adaptive system, national capability aggregates across a distributed architecture. The state functions as a micronetwork, integrating subnodes like AI data centers, global supply chains, universities, and financial systems. This broad integration of disparate assets into national capability defines distributed intelligence. This concept is grounded in the economic theories of distributed knowledge. As Friedrich Hayek observed, relevant knowledge is inherently dispersed across millions of participants in a system. It is simply too vast to be centralized by any single authority. National power, therefore, operates as a cybernetic function. It relies on a state's capacity to process and act upon this scattered intelligence effectively. A state's geopolitical resilience depends squarely on its internal network complexity and processing speed, rendering raw military hardware and executive hierarchy secondary. This triad charts the classical dichotomy of international relations ethics that has historically dominated foreign policy. On one side is pure idealism. Under this view, universal values dictate action regardless of the practical consequences. This is highly visible in Kantian ethics and the Wilsonian internationalism of the early 20th century. On the opposite side sits pure realism. Here, the accumulation and projection of hard power is the only metric of success that matters. You see this extending from Thucydides up through Thomas Hobbes, where survival relies purely on leverage and force. The Carney-Stubb view rejects both of these extremes. Neither approach is sufficient for managing a complex adaptive system. Instead, they introduce a third position, values-based realism. To understand the mechanics of this, we have to look to biological evolution. This introduces evolutionary ethics, the premise that successful moral systems survive and propagate specifically because they increase the collective survival of the group. Under this model, societal values like honesty, cooperation, the rule of law, and institutional trust function as highly effective hard power adaptive strategies. This gives rise to the ethics of resilience. The highest ethical principle moves away from simply doing what is right in a vacuum, focusing instead on how a society can maintain its functionality under severe stress. In a distributed global network, democratic values act as the binding agent. They generate the redundancy and trust required to prevent systemic collapse, operating as essential strategic assets. When you synthesize these structural, economic, and ethical models, they merge into a single, overarching framework known as continuity theory. This matrix charts parallels between the Carney-Stubb view and systems regulation. Structurally, temporary coalitions map to biological functional units. Ethically, societal values mirror regulatory balance in physical systems. And capability, distributed global power functions like neural processing. Stability relies on the network. These frameworks replace the idea of fixed equilibrium with dynamic regulation. Stability in complex systems requires an active, ongoing management of disorder. The reality of international stability is simply the continuous maintenance of an evolving balance near a homeostatic axis. Statecraft prioritizes the preservation of adaptive capacity and institutional trust, treating the national interest as a biological function of survival. Geopolitical survival is contingent on the capacity for resilient continuity.